decorated soldier boards a flight, ready to head home after months of service. But when he tries to take his seat in first class, the flight attendant stops him cold. What happens next will shock you, and it changes everything for the airline and its passengers. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Sergeant David Parker had just wrapped up a long and grueling 9-month deployment overseas. After leaving behind the constant tension of conflict, every step toward the airport felt like a stride toward a long-awaited sanctuary. The weight of endless days and sleepless nights slowly lifted as he imagined a quiet flight, a serene passage home where peace replaced the echoes of battle. His uniform, a proud emblem of his sacrifice, shone softly under the terminal lights, and his military ID swung gently at his chest, a constant reminder of the honor he carried. The upgrade to first class, granted as a heartfelt nod to his service, spoke volumes of gratitude and respect, rekindling a spark of hope amidst his exhaustion. Past journeys had been punctuated by genuine smiles and courteous thank you from airline staff, gestures that had always bolstered his spirit. Today, as he navigated the smooth boarding process, each step forward was infused with the promise of reprieve and a comforting retreat from the relentless strain of deployment. When he entered the plane, the flight attendant, a woman in her mid-40s, stood near the entrance, greeting passengers with a forced smile. Sergeant David Parker greeted her back politely, and she asked to see his boarding pass. No problem, he thought as he handed it over. She took a quick glance at it, nodded, and gestured for him to move toward the front of the plane. It wasn't a long walk, but it felt a little longer as he made his way past rows of seats, knowing that comfort and rest awaited him. However, things were about to take a turn that he didn't expect. As Sergeant David Parker stepped toward his designated first-class seat, an unexpected chill ran down his spine. The atmosphere shifted subtly. The usual hum of courteous announcements seemed to fall into an eerie silence. In that brief suspended moment, the flight attendant's expression darkened, her eyes hardening as if the weight of unspoken rules now pressed upon her. She looked at him for a moment, then said, "I'm sorry, sir, but this seat is not available for you." The unexpected rebuff left him momentarily stunned. He found himself searching her face for any hint of explanation, yet all he saw was a stark, unyielding barrier. Confused and disoriented, he could only muster a quiet, "Excuse me?" in a low but firm voice. The flight attendant repeated herself, "This seat is not available for you." Her tone was devoid of empathy or explanation, her eyes fixed in a cold, dismissive stare that cut deeper than any physical blow. Surveying the near-empty first-class cabin, he noticed that every seat seemed to beckon with the promise of solace and comfort, a stark contrast to the exclusion he felt. "There are plenty of empty seats. I have a first-class ticket," he said, his patience beginning to wear thin. "I'm in the military program. I was upgraded." Yet his words dissolved into the sterile air as she merely shook her head, her resolve unmoved. "I don't care about that. I have to ask you to move to your assigned seat in the back." Each word sank like a stone, deepening the mix of confusion and simmering frustration that churned within him. Here he was, a dedicated soldier adorned in full uniform, a symbol of honor and sacrifice, being unceremoniously redirected to a less privileged space. The injustice was palpable. He had given so much for his country, only to be met with an unyielding dismissal that stung with every syllable. Striving to reclaim some measure of composure amidst the whirlwind of emotions, he spoke once more, this time with a firmer tone tinged with determination. "Can you please check with the manager?" But the response was immediate and unyielding. "No, she snapped. "Just take a seat in the back." Sergeant David Parker's heart sank. He had dealt with some rude people in his life, but this felt different. He was a soldier in full uniform, and this woman was telling him to go sit in the back of the plane? Even though he had been upgraded? He couldn't understand it. His frustration was building, but he decided not to escalate the situation just yet. He turned to walk back to the coach section, but then he stopped. Glancing back at the vacant first-class cabin, he felt an unyielding resolve well up inside him. He could not simply let this injustice slide away. Determined, he pivoted on his heel and approached the attendant once again, calmly reiterating his request to speak with the manager. Yet her reply was as icy as before, her tone dismissive and unchanging, leaving him baffled by the unfolding scene. Despite his respectful demeanor, every fiber of his being screamed that something was deeply amiss, compelling him to assert his dignity. As moments stretched interminably, he realized that without an intervention from someone in authority, his words would vanish into thin air. With a steadying breath, he summoned all his inner strength. This was different from any challenge he had faced before. The palpable tension in the air, underscored by her curt tone and indifferent attitude, made him feel not only disrespected, but also profoundly isolated. Throughout his travels, from bustling terminals to the plush confines of first class, he had never encountered such a blatant disregard for his hard-earned privileges. Slowly, he began his walk toward the rear of the plane, burdened by the heavy weight of injustice. He sensed the curious and uneasy gazes of fellow passengers, some silently questioning the encounter, others seemingly too reserved or intimidated to intervene. All the while, the flight attendant lingered near the front, her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on him, as if silently passing judgment on every step he took. She didn't even offer an apology or a second glance. She just stood there, as if he were the one who was in the wrong. Sergeant David Parker made his way to the back of the plane, his mind racing. Seated in his assigned economy seat, he felt an overwhelming surge of conflicting emotions. Anger, confusion, and a deep sense of humiliation that cut sharper than he had ever anticipated. It was only a seat, one might say, yet to him it symbolized something far greater, the hard-earned respect of a lifetime dedicated to service for his country. Every fiber of his being resonated with the injustice of being dismissed so callously. As flight attendants methodically moved up and down the aisle, their routine underscored the isolation he felt, while the incident replayed relentlessly in his mind. How could someone deny him the courtesy of the first-class seat he had been granted? It wasn't merely about comfort, it was about being acknowledged as a valued individual, a recognition of both his sacrifices and his identity. Drawing upon a reservoir of inner strength, he inhaled deeply, his resolve hardening with each breath. Rising from his seat, he refused to accept being sidelined any longer. He moved purposefully toward the front of the plane, his eyes scanning for the presence of authority that could restore fairness to the situation. Determination replaced his earlier silence. This was no longer a request, but a demand for the respect he deserved. Reaching the front, he was met with a cold, unyielding look from the flight attendant, who continued her tasks without so much as a word of explanation. For several agonizing moments, he searched the cabin for any sign of the manager, his heart thudding in his chest as every second stretched out interminably. The tension was almost palpable. Would anyone stand up for him, or was he destined to bear this indignity alone? Then, just as his hope began to wane, the door at the front of the plane opened and the manager stepped in. Sergeant David Parker felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone with authority. The flight attendant, still standing near the front, quickly approached him. Her words tumbled out in a hurried, almost conspiratorial murmur, a rush of sound that Sergeant David Parker couldn't quite decipher, his focus narrowed by the weight of the moment. In that brief encounter, every syllable seemed lost in the whirlwind of his determination to obtain a fair resolution, his mind set on reclaiming the respect he deserved. As she signaled him, the manager gave a measured nod, and their eyes locked in a silent exchange. For a fleeting second, the manager's gaze radiated nothing but the professionalism he'd hoped for, and Parker's heart dared to believe that justice might prevail. Yet, beneath that polished veneer, he caught a subtle flicker, a hint that the manager's allegiance might not lie entirely with him, but perhaps with the flight attendant instead. "Is there a problem here, sir?" the manager inquired, his tone courteous yet laced with a reserved detachment. Sergeant David Parker steadied himself with a deep, deliberate breath before replying, "Yes, there is. This flight attendant refused to let me sit in the first-class seat that I've been upgraded to. I've got a valid first-class ticket, part of the military appreciation program. She told me that seat wasn't available, and when I tried to explain, she insisted I sit in the back." His voice, though calm, carried a sharpened edge, a firm declaration that he would not be sidelined or disrespected any longer. The manager shifted his attention briefly to the flight attendant, who now stood rigidly with her arms crossed, her silence echoing louder than any rebuttal. In that moment, the unspoken tension between them was palpable, the air thick with uncertainty as the manager's expression betrayed a fleeting pause, a hesitation that sent a shiver of doubt through Parker. For one agonizing second he wondered if his plea would be heard, or if the scales of fairness would tip further away from him. After what felt like an eternity, the manager returned his gaze and said, "I see. Let me check on that for you." His voice, smooth yet imbued with a chilling coolness, made Parker feel as if he were the instigator of a disturbance, rather than a victim of unwarranted treatment. Sergeant David Parker could sense that the manager wasn't exactly rushing to fix the situation. "Thank you," he said, keeping his voice steady, but his patience was thinning. He watched as the manager walked toward the cockpit area, no longer in sight. The flight attendant, still standing near the front, gave Sergeant David Parker an unreadable look. There was something unsettling about her, but Sergeant David Parker wasn't going to let her intimidation get to him. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Sergeant David Parker sat back in his seat, trying to calm his thoughts. The minutes stretched on, but no one returned. He glanced around at the other passengers, some of whom were watching the interaction intently. A few passengers exchanged uneasy looks, but no one spoke up. It seemed like the whole cabin was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would the manager return with an apology, or would Sergeant David Parker be forced to sit quietly in the back, as if nothing had happened? Just as he was starting to lose his patience completely, the manager returned. He walked briskly down the aisle, his expression now more serious, more focused. This time he wasn't alone. The airline's chief supervisor, a woman in a sharp suit, was walking behind him. She seemed to be there for backup. This wasn't just an ordinary situation anymore. Something was clearly being taken more seriously. Sergeant David Parker straightened up in his seat, bracing for what would come next. The tension was thick, but he had made it clear that he wouldn't settle for anything less than the respect he deserved. The manager and the supervisor approached Sergeant David Parker, and for the first time the weight of the situation seemed to fully settle in. The supervisor's sharp eyes scanned the area quickly, taking in the scene. Sergeant David Parker could tell she wasn't pleased. She seemed like someone who valued efficiency, but also someone who understood the importance of handling situations properly. "Sergeant David Parker, I'm very sorry for the inconvenience," the manager began, his voice now lacking the coldness from before, but there was something strange in his tone. It wasn't exactly apologetic, just a formal acknowledgement of the issue. "I've spoken with our flight attendant and I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Sergeant David Parker didn't buy it. The words felt rehearsed, like something he had heard before when companies tried to cover their tracks. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice calm but heavy with frustration. "How is it a misunderstanding when she refused to let me sit in a seat I'm entitled to? I've got my military ID and a first-class ticket. I don't understand what's unclear about that." The manager shifted his weight slightly, a small sign of discomfort, and he didn't immediately respond. The supervisor, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "Sergeant David Parker, let me assure you that we take these matters seriously. We have policies in place to ensure all of our passengers are treated with respect, regardless of their background or status." Her voice was firm and authoritative, and it gave Sergeant David Parker a glimmer of hope, as she didn't sound like someone who would tolerate unfair treatment. However, the supervisor's next words took Sergeant David Parker by surprise. "Unfortunately, we do not have a specific military program that guarantees first-class upgrades across the board. What you were told earlier might have been a miscommunication." Sergeant David Parker stared at her, his frustration reaching a boiling point. "Miscommunication? Are you telling me that I'm just supposed to accept that I was lied to? I've flown with this airline multiple times before. I've been upgraded before, and this isn't about a program. It's about basic respect." He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the anger threatening to boil over. The supervisor's expression didn't change, but the manager shifted uncomfortably, clearly not prepared for this level of confrontation. "Sir," the manager interjected, "we're doing our best to resolve the issue. I've looked into your ticket, and I can confirm that your upgrade was indeed legitimate. However, I think there was a mix-up with the seat assignment." He paused, glancing back at the attendant who was still standing by the front, now with her arms tightly folded across her chest, looking more defensive than ever. "The seat is available, but there is some confusion in our system." Sergeant David Parker didn't believe that for a second. The seat was empty, the flight was far from full, and if there had been a legitimate issue, someone should have explained it to him clearly from the start, not dismiss him so rudely. He felt like he was being blamed for the airline's mistake, and it made him angry. He wasn't just being told to sit in the back of the plane anymore. He was being gaslighted. Before he could respond, the supervisor spoke again, this time with a slight shift in her tone. "I understand your frustration, Sergeant, and I do apologize for how this has been handled. However, this situation needs to be addressed in the proper way." Her eyes flicked toward the flight attendant, who was now standing a few paces away, watching the exchange intently. "We will review her actions and take appropriate steps." The air grew heavy as Sergeant David Parker processed what she said. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about a flight attendant who had treated him unfairly, someone who had failed to do her job properly. The airline had failed to manage the situation from the start, and now they were trying to spin it into something less than it was. He couldn't help but wonder if they would actually hold her accountable, or if this would all just blow over. Silence hung in the air as Sergeant David Parker waited, watching the flight attendant from the corner of his eye. She still hadn't spoken, but her body language told him everything he needed to know. She was tense, defensive, and clearly uncomfortable. The question was, would she be allowed to get away with it, or would someone take action? Then, as if on cue, the supervisor turned to the manager and said something in a low voice. The manager nodded in response, and for a moment the conversation seemed to shift. Sergeant David Parker could feel something changing in the air. The supervisor walked toward the flight attendant, and that's when things took a sudden, unexpected turn. The supervisor approached the flight attendant, who was still standing near the front with her arms tightly crossed and her eyes fixed on the ground. She hadn't spoken since the manager's arrival, but now, as the supervisor reached her, the tension in the air thickened. The manager stood a few paces behind them, watching the interaction closely, as if he were waiting for something to happen. Sergeant David Parker couldn't hear their conversation, but the flight attendant's posture stiffened even further. Her hands, which had been nervously fiddling with the hem of her uniform, were now tightly clenched. She seemed to shrink under the supervisor's gaze, which only made Sergeant David Parker more suspicious. The supervisor said something in a calm but firm voice. Whatever it was, it seemed to hit a nerve. The flight attendant's expression shifted slightly. There was a flash of anger in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. The supervisor then turned toward Sergeant David Parker and gave him a brief, tight-lipped smile. "Sergeant, we've spoken with our flight attendant and we've addressed the situation internally. We will be reviewing this matter further after the flight," she said, her voice steady but with an underlying edge, as if she knew this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Sergeant David Parker could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't satisfied with just a review. That was the corporate way of sweeping things under the rug. He had already spent enough time trying to explain himself. He had already been told he was wrong, without anyone even listening to his side. But there was something different now. The supervisor wasn't brushing him off anymore. She had acknowledged the issue, and the flight attendant's nervous energy wasn't lost on him. Still, he didn't let his guard down. "What do you mean by review? Are you going to just let her get away with this?" Sergeant David Parker asked, his voice sharp. Now, he wasn't going to settle for a vague response. He wanted answers. The manager, who had been standing silently behind the supervisor, stepped forward. "Sergeant, I assure you that this will be taken seriously. We'll be looking into the actions of the flight attendant, and I will personally ensure that proper steps are taken," he said in a measured tone. However, Sergeant David Parker could hear the faint hint of unease creeping in. Sergeant David Parker stared at him, still unconvinced. "And what happens to her? She just gets to go back to her job after causing all this trouble?" he demanded. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but the supervisor cut him off. "No, Sergeant, we take these matters seriously. We will be reviewing her conduct, and if the investigation finds that her actions were out of line, there will be consequences." Her words were more direct, as if she was finally taking control of the situation. Sergeant David Parker's eyes narrowed. There it was. The first acknowledgement that the flight attendant's actions might have been more than just a mistake. The supervisor's response made it clear that something was being done behind the scenes. But what did that really mean? What consequences would she face? Would it be enough to make up for the way he was treated? He didn't know yet, but for the first time he felt like the situation was starting to move in the right direction. The flight attendant, still standing off to the side, wasn't saying anything. She hadn't apologized, and she wasn't going to. Her silence spoke volumes. Sergeant David Parker couldn't help but wonder if she even realized how serious the situation had become. Her lack of accountability and her refusal to admit her mistake had now escalated into something far worse than an awkward encounter. The supervisor's words made it clear. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a failure of professionalism, and it had consequences. "Sergeant, I understand your frustration," the supervisor continued. "We're going to make sure that this situation is handled appropriately. Thank you for your patience." Sergeant David Parker stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. He wasn't feeling victorious, not yet, but there was a shift in the air. Something was finally being done. The flight attendant's actions had been called out, and she wasn't getting away with it, but just as he was about to respond, the supervisor's tone became more serious, almost cold. "However," she added, looking at him sharply, "this situation is still under review, and until we complete that review, I can't provide any further details." Sergeant David Parker clenched his jaw. "I'm not about to leave things unresolved. I'll be expecting an update," he said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't over." The supervisor gave a quick nod, but Sergeant David Parker could tell she wasn't going to make any promises. He wasn't naive enough to think everything would be fixed immediately, but at least for now, it seemed like someone was finally taking responsibility. As the conversation came to a close, Sergeant David Parker felt a mix of emotions: relief that something was being done, but also a lingering sense of anger that it had taken so long to get here. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The situation was still brewing beneath the surface, and Sergeant David Parker had the distinct feeling that it was about to explode in a way no one expected. As the supervisor turned away, signaling the end of their conversation, Sergeant David Parker couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't fully settled. There was still too much uncertainty hanging in the air. The flight attendant, still standing by the front of the cabin, hadn't once looked him in the eye. Her silence spoke volumes to him. It felt like she was either too proud to apologize or too unwilling to admit any wrongdoing. Either way, her behavior had set this whole situation in motion, and Sergeant David Parker couldn't just let it go without a clear resolution. As the minutes passed, the tension on the plane remained thick, but the flight continued on as if nothing had happened. Sergeant David Parker returned to his seat, his thoughts racing. The stewardess came by with drinks a little while later, but she didn't make eye contact with him. She kept her distance, almost as if she were afraid to interact with him any further. The unease was palpable. Sergeant David Parker leaned back in his seat, trying to relax, but every time he closed his eyes, his thoughts snapped back to the way he had been treated. He knew it wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about respect, something he had earned through years of service. Something that had been denied to him for no reason. That's what hurt the most. He had been the one to approach the flight attendant politely, to try to explain the situation calmly, yet it was he who had been dismissed and disrespected. He couldn't help but replay the confrontation in his mind, the way she had looked at him when he first approached the seat, the dismissive tone, the way she had insisted without even checking that the seat wasn't available. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a blatant refusal to treat him with the respect he deserved, a refusal to even listen to his explanation, and that was something he wouldn't just forget. A few more minutes passed, but no one came to check on him. No one apologized. Not even a simple acknowledgement of the discomfort he'd endured. The flight attendants went about their duties, moving around the cabin, but the sense of tension remained. It was as if everyone was just pretending everything was normal, hoping the incident would blow over. Sergeant David Parker glanced toward the front of the cabin again. He could see the flight attendant standing by the galley talking to another crew member. She looked relaxed now, as if she had returned to her usual duties, but there was something about the way she held herself that seemed off. There was no hint of remorse, no recognition that she had crossed a line. Sergeant David Parker had seen enough in his career to know when things were being swept under the rug. This felt like one of those situations where the airline wanted to resolve it quickly, move past it, and hope the passengers would forget about it. But he couldn't let it go this time. He waited a little longer, but the flight didn't seem to be slowing down in any way. The smooth hum of the engines and the occasional chatter from the other passengers made the whole experience feel like a distant memory, but inside Sergeant David Parker, he couldn't let go. His mind was still on the exchange, the way he had been dismissed, the way the flight attendant had humiliated him in front of everyone. He couldn't just sit there and hope for the best. He needed answers. It wasn't until the plane began its descent that things finally took another turn. The seatbelt sign came on, and the cabin lights dimmed, signaling that they were nearing their destination. At that moment, the flight attendant approached his seat. This time, there was no eye contact at all. She just stood there silently, waiting for Sergeant David Parker to fasten his seatbelt. Her presence was uncomfortable, awkward, but there was something else now, too. A subtle shift in her posture. The confidence that she had exhibited earlier in the flight seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a quiet, nervous energy. Sergeant David Parker stared at her for a moment, considering whether or not to speak. There were so many things he could say, but he wasn't sure if it would make a difference. Instead, he simply nodded and complied, strapping himself in. But as she moved on to the next row, he couldn't help but wonder what was going to happen next. The plane touched down without incident, but the tension in the cabin lingered as passengers began to gather their belongings. Sergeant David Parker stood up, gathering his things, his eyes still on the flight attendant. She was busy helping passengers retrieve their bags from the overhead bins, but there was no attempt at eye contact, no acknowledgement of the interaction they had just shared. It was as if it hadn't even happened, as if the whole thing had just been a blip on the radar for her. But for Sergeant David Parker, it was far from over. As the plane came to a complete stop and the captain's voice came over the intercom, Sergeant David Parker stood in the aisle, waiting for the doors to open. The flight attendants began to prepare for disembarkation, and as Sergeant David Parker moved toward the exit, he saw the supervisor standing by the gate talking with another crew member. The supervisor's eyes met his as he walked toward the door, and for the first time that day, Sergeant David Parker felt a flicker of something that might resemble accountability. But was it enough? Would the airline take real action, or would this just be another forgotten incident, swept under the rug by the powers that be? The only thing Sergeant David Parker knew for sure was that this wasn't the last time anyone would hear about what happened. The wheels of justice, slow as they might be, were finally beginning to turn. But how far would they go? Only time would tell as Sergeant David Parker stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal. The weight of the situation still lingered. He moved through the crowd of passengers, feeling a strange mix of relief and frustration. Relief that the ordeal was over, for now at least, but frustration because he knew something had to be done. This couldn't just be brushed aside like so many other situations he'd seen in his career. The mistreatment, the lack of accountability, it wasn't right, and he wasn't going to let it go. He didn't know what would happen next. The supervisor had said they would review the flight attendant's actions, but he had heard corporate speak like that before. Promises to review and investigate usually meant the issue would get buried, and everyone would move on with their lives. But Sergeant David Parker couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at stake here. It wasn't just about a first-class seat. It was about the principle of respect. And that principle had been violated in a way that wasn't going to disappear just because the flight had landed safely. Sergeant David Parker made his way to baggage claim, where he grabbed his bag off the conveyor belt and then paused, staring at the crowd moving around him. He couldn't help but wonder how many other people had been treated this way, in ways big or small, that they had just let slide. The flight attendant's behavior hadn't been a fluke. It had been deliberate, and worse, it had been a sign of something deeper, an attitude that too many people in positions of power had when dealing with others, especially people like him, people in uniform, people who served their country. But Sergeant David Parker wasn't going to be silent about this. He couldn't be. He was no longer just the soldier on the flight. He was someone who had seen the system fail time and time again, and he wasn't about to let this be just another one of those cases. As he left the terminal and stepped out into the crisp air, he pulled out his phone. The first thing he did was look up the airline's customer service number. If he was going to get any real answers, it was up to him to make sure they were held accountable. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he knew he had to follow through. Before he dialed the number, his phone buzzed with a new notification. It was an email, and the subject line caught his attention immediately. Important update regarding your recent experience with airline name. It was from the airline, and although he had no idea what it might say, he opened it curiously. The email started with a generic apology, the kind that companies always send when there's a complaint. We regret that your recent experience with airline name did not meet our standards of service. But then it got more specific. The email mentioned the incident on his flight and stated that they had taken immediate action to address the situation internally. There was also a brief mention of an ongoing investigation, but what stood out was the final line. As a result of this incident, the flight attendant involved has been suspended pending further review. Sergeant David Parker stopped for a moment, his finger hovering over the screen. Suspended? That was a start. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't the kind of resolution he had hoped for, but it was something, an acknowledgement he had never expected, immediate answers. But seeing that the airline had taken some action made him feel like there was still a chance for something real to come of this. He sat down on a nearby bench, processing the email. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't a full resolution, but it was a step. He couldn't let his guard down just yet, though the email mentioned that the investigation was still ongoing, which meant the flight attendant's suspension was temporary. Sergeant David Parker knew the company could always choose to quietly reinstate her if they decided the matter wasn't as serious as it seemed, but he wasn't going to let that happen. Not without a fight. He took a deep breath and made the call to customer service. As he was put on hold, he reviewed everything in his mind. The flight, the confrontation, the manager's promises, and the supervisor's words. He wasn't sure where this call would lead, but he knew it was important. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about holding the airline accountable for how they handled the situation and making sure that no one else would go through what he had experienced. When someone finally answered the phone, Sergeant David Parker began calmly explaining his experience, making sure to stick to the facts. He spoke about how he had been treated, how the flight attendant had refused to let him sit in his seat despite his valid first-class ticket, and how the airline had mishandled the situation from the very beginning. The customer service representative listened without interruption, and when Sergeant David Parker finished, there was a long pause on the other end. "I apologize, sir," the representative said, his voice sincere. "We take these matters very seriously, and I'll make sure this is escalated to the right team." Sergeant David Parker couldn't shake the feeling that it was just another standard response, but at least this person wasn't trying to shut him down. He reiterated the importance of holding the flight attendant accountable, of making sure that the company followed through on their promises. The representative assured him they would do just that. As the call ended, Sergeant David Parker sat back, his mind still racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The wheels were in motion, but he knew the real work was just beginning. The airline's response was just the start. And he wasn't going to rest until he saw it through. For the first time since the incident, Sergeant David Parker felt a sense of control. This wasn't a fight he was going to lose. This wasn't a situation that could just be swept under the rug. He had been disrespected, but he was determined to make sure that disrespect was recognized and addressed. The truth was, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for anyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or mistreated. And this time, it wasn't going to be forgotten. The next few days were a blur for Sergeant David Parker. The initial shock of the incident had worn off, but the frustration lingered, simmering beneath the surface. He had done everything he could to push the airline for answers, but now he was in a holding pattern, just waiting to see what would happen next. Every time his phone rang, he picked it up quickly, hoping it was an update on the situation, but all he got were automated emails, customer service responses, and the occasional vague assurance that the investigation was still ongoing. He had no idea how long the process would take. It could be days, weeks, or even months before he got any real closure. But one thing was certain: the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a systemic issue. The flight attendant's behavior, her blatant disregard for his status as a service member, wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something deeper, something ingrained in the way the airline operated. Sergeant David Parker knew this wasn't just about him. He wasn't the only one who had ever been mistreated. He wasn't the only one who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or treated unfairly because of his uniform. There were other soldiers, other people who had traveled with the airline, who might have been subjected to similar treatment. They just hadn't said anything. He knew that, and it drove him to keep pushing for justice. Not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been treated the same way. A week later, Sergeant David Parker received another email from the airline, and this time it was different. The subject line read, "Final update, resolution of your recent incident." He hesitated for a moment before opening it, his heart pounding as he clicked on the message. The email started with another apology, but this time it was more specific. He had explained that after a thorough review of the flight attendant's actions, the airline had decided to terminate her employment, effective immediately. The email also included a detailed breakdown of the investigation process, stating that interviews had been conducted with multiple passengers and crew members who had witnessed the incident. The airline assured Sergeant David Parker that they had taken the matter seriously and that they would continue to prioritize customer service and respect for all passengers moving forward. Sergeant David Parker felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Part of him was relieved. Finally, the airline had done something decisive. The flight attendant would no longer be able to treat anyone the way she had treated him. But another part of him felt uneasy. The situation had escalated so quickly, and the consequences were severe. A job lost, a reputation tarnished, all because of a single interaction. He didn't want anyone to lose their livelihood, but he also knew that her actions had crossed a line. There was no going back from that. Still, the resolution felt like a victory, even if it came at a high cost. Sergeant David Parker had fought for respect, and in the end he had gotten it. More than that, he had forced the airline to confront its own flaws. They could no longer hide behind corporate language and empty promises. They had been forced to make a tough decision, and that was something he could live with. A few days later, he received a personal call from the airline's customer relations manager. It was the first time someone from the company had reached out to him directly. The manager thanked him for his patience throughout the process and reiterated that the company was committed to providing a better experience for its passengers. He also offered Sergeant David Parker a complimentary round-trip flight as a gesture of goodwill. Sergeant David Parker wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't interested in free flights. What he really wanted was accountability, and in some way, he had gotten that. The manager spoke with sincerity, and for the first time, Sergeant David Parker felt like the airline was genuinely trying to make things right. He appreciated the gesture, but it wasn't the flight that mattered. What mattered was that the airline had finally done the right thing. As the call ended, Sergeant David Parker put down his phone and sat in silence for a moment. It had been a long journey, from the moment he had stepped onto that plane, to the anger and frustration he had felt, to the eventual resolution that had come after so much waiting and persistence. It had taken a lot out of him, but in the end, he knew he had made a difference. He had stood up for himself, and for the many others who might never have spoken out. Sergeant David Parker looked out the window, watching as the sun began to set. The world outside was quiet and peaceful, but he knew that things had changed, not just for him, but for the airline, for the flight attendant, and for anyone who might face disrespect in the future. The fight wasn't over, but it was a step forward, and that to him was enough for now. As the days went by, Sergeant David Parker couldn't shake the feeling that this whole situation had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. The more he reflected on it, the more he realized that the fight had become about something much bigger. About standing up for respect, accountability, and the idea that people in positions of authority should treat others with dignity, regardless of their rank, appearance, or background. It had been hard to stay patient during those long days of waiting. The back-and-forth emails, the vague assurances from customer service. It all felt like a corporate shell game meant to keep him distracted while they moved on to the next issue, and there were moments when he doubted whether the airline would really follow through on their promises. After all, they could easily ignore him and pretend like the situation never happened. He had seen that happen too many times before, where businesses put up a facade of caring, but ultimately did nothing to address the real issues. But then came that final email, the one that confirmed the flight attendant's termination. It was hard to reconcile the fact that someone had lost their job because of an interaction that had started out as a simple misunderstanding. Sergeant David Parker didn't feel good about it, but at the same time, he knew there was no other option. The flight attendant had failed to do her job and had treated him in a way that was completely unacceptable. No amount of corporate doublespeak could erase that. The termination didn't just represent a victory for Sergeant David Parker. It was a sign that the airline had been forced to face the ugly reality of how some of its employees behaved. The company had no choice but to hold someone accountable, and that was a win in itself. Still, a part of him felt uneasy. People's lives weren't supposed to be tossed aside so quickly. It made him wonder how many other flight attendants or staff members had made similar mistakes. How many times passengers like him had been treated poorly in small, seemingly insignificant ways that no one ever noticed. The phone call from the airline's customer relations manager had been a nice touch, but it didn't change the fact that something had gone terribly wrong in the first place. The manager had offered his apologies, and while they seemed genuine, Sergeant David Parker couldn't help but feel that they were also motivated by a desire to close the case quickly and move on. Offering him a free round-trip flight seemed like an attempt to smooth things over, but Sergeant David Parker didn't want freebies. He wanted respect. He didn't want it to be a token gesture or an afterthought. He had been treated unfairly, and the price of that wasn't something that could be erased by a flight voucher. But he couldn't deny that, in a strange way, the process had opened his eyes to the importance of standing up for oneself. Before this, Sergeant David Parker had always been a quiet, reserved person, content to go about his business without making waves. He'd always kept his head down, focusing on his work, his service, and his duties, but now he realized that silence wasn't always the answer. Sometimes you had to speak up. Sometimes you had to make noise. He had learned that the hard way, but in doing so he had forced change, not just for himself, but for others who might face the same situation in the future. Even after the termination, even after the apology, Sergeant David Parker knew the story wasn't over. There were still questions left unanswered. The airline had taken action, yes, but how would they ensure that something like this wouldn't happen again? Was it just one bad apple, or was there a deeper issue within the company's culture that allowed this kind of treatment to happen in the first place? Sergeant David Parker didn't have all the answers, but he knew that this wasn't a situation he could simply forget. It wasn't just about holding one person accountable. It was about pushing for change, making sure that the airline, and perhaps others in the industry, took a hard look at how they treated their customers, especially those who served in the military. He thought about the other passengers on that flight. Had any of them noticed what happened? Had they seen the flight attendant's refusal to let him sit in the first-class seat? The way she had treated him with such disdain? He hadn't expected anyone to stand up for him. It wasn't the kind of thing that usually drew attention, especially on a crowded flight. But he realized that even though he had felt alone in that moment, he wasn't. There were countless others who had probably been in similar situations, feeling overlooked or disrespected. Maybe they hadn't said anything, maybe they hadn't made a big deal out of it, but that didn't mean they hadn't noticed. Sergeant David Parker knew that when people were silent, it didn't mean they didn't care, it just meant they were waiting for someone else to speak up. And that was where he came in. By standing up for himself, he had given others permission to do the same. He didn't know how this story would end, but he had started a conversation, and that was the first step in changing the culture, both at the airline and beyond. In the weeks that followed, he continued to follow up with the airline, ensuring they kept their word and implemented the changes they promised. He made it clear that he wasn't going away until he saw the full picture. He wasn't just another disgruntled passenger who wanted a quick fix. He wanted accountability. He wanted change. Every time he reached out, he was met with more assurances that the airline was working on it. But Sergeant David Parker wasn't about to let them off the hook. He was patient but persistent, and he would continue to be until he saw results. It wasn't just about the flight attendant anymore. It was about making sure that people like him, people who had earned their place, would never have to experience that kind of disrespect again, whether it was from the airline or from the world at large. Sergeant David Parker knew that his fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of what had happened began to settle deeper into Sergeant David Parker's mind. The situation with the flight attendant, the uncomfortable confrontation, the series of emails and phone calls. It all felt like a distant memory at times, but in other ways it was still very much alive. It wasn't just the resolution he had sought, it was the process itself that had become the turning point for him. He had expected some closure, a quiet apology, a standard response, but what he had gotten was something far more impactful, an experience that would change how he saw himself and how he approached the world. Sergeant David Parker hadn't been a vocal person throughout his military career. He had been someone who preferred to handle things on his own, quietly and professionally. If there was a problem, he dealt with it, and if it wasn't something he could fix, he moved on. But the incident on that flight had pushed him into unfamiliar territory. It had forced him to speak up, to fight for something bigger than just his seat on the plane. It was about his dignity, his service, and ultimately the respect he deserved, not just as a soldier, but as a person. The airline had been cooperative to some extent, but Sergeant David Parker couldn't shake the feeling that they were only doing the bare minimum to resolve the issue. Yes, the flight attendant had been fired, and yes, the airline had promised to do better in the future, but he wasn't interested in corporate reassurances or empty promises. He had seen how easily companies could spin a situation, make a quick fix, and then move on without changing anything of real substance. He wasn't going to let them get away with that. Not this time. So he kept pushing. He sent follow-up emails asking for more details on the investigation, pressing for information on what steps the airline was taking to ensure such incidents didn't happen again. He asked about their training processes for employees, about how they handled complaints, about how they intended to foster a culture of respect for all passengers, especially those who served in the military. He was relentless because he knew that if he didn't keep the pressure on, nothing would change. Then one day, out of the blue, he got a call. It was from the customer relations manager again, but this time the tone of the conversation was different. The manager was no longer offering vague reassurances. This time, he was speaking to Sergeant David Parker as if they were equals, as if they were both partners in a conversation about real change. "Sergeant David Parker," the manager said, "we've been listening to your feedback and I want to thank you for your persistence. We've reviewed our internal procedures, and I'm happy to inform you that we've decided to implement a company-wide training initiative focused on diversity, respect, and military appreciation." Sergeant David Parker was taken aback. He had expected the usual corporate jargon, but this was different. The company was not just apologizing, they were taking concrete action. The manager explained that following the incident, the airline had conducted a full review of its staff training programs, particularly in how employees interacted with military personnel. They were planning to roll out new training for all flight attendants and customer service staff, focusing on cultural sensitivity, understanding the unique needs of military members, and fostering a greater sense of respect and professionalism in all interactions. Sergeant David Parker felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected: hope. He had pushed for change, and now it was happening. It wasn't just about the flight attendant anymore. It was about making sure that every soldier, every person who had served their country, would be treated with the respect they deserved, not just by this airline, but by others as well. The manager continued, telling Sergeant David Parker that the airline was also establishing a direct line for military personnel to report any incidents or concerns they faced during their travels. They were creating a system where soldiers, veterans, and their families could speak up without fear of being ignored or brushed off. It was a small step, but Sergeant David Parker could feel the weight of it. This wasn't a token gesture. It was a real attempt to make things right. For the first time, he felt like he was being heard. The phone call ended with an invitation for Sergeant David Parker to meet with the airline's senior leadership team to discuss the changes in person and to provide his input on how the airline could continue to improve. He agreed, though part of him was still in disbelief. A major company was actually asking for his opinion, taking his experience seriously. As the meeting approached, Sergeant David Parker found himself reflecting on the journey that had led him here. He had been just another passenger on a flight, doing his best to get home after a long deployment. But in the span of a few weeks, he had gone from feeling disrespected and dismissed to becoming a voice for change within a major corporation. It was an unexpected outcome, but it was one that had taken determination, persistence, and a willingness to stand up when it mattered. On the day of the meeting, Sergeant David Parker, dressed in his uniform, the weight of his military experience settling on his shoulders as he walked into the airline's corporate headquarters. He was met by a small group of executives, all eager to hear his thoughts. They apologized again for the incident, but this time their words felt genuine. They weren't just checking off a box. They were listening, asking questions, taking notes, and showing a willingness to understand what had gone wrong. Sergeant David Parker spent the next few hours talking with them, sharing his experience in detail and offering suggestions on how they could ensure that this didn't happen again. He told them about the importance of respect, about how small gestures could make a big difference, about how an airline could show its appreciation for military members without it feeling like a token gesture. He told them that they needed to do more than just apologize. They needed to make military appreciation part of their company culture, something that was embedded in everything they did, from training to customer service. By the end of the meeting, Sergeant David Parker felt a sense of satisfaction. He hadn't expected the executives to be genuinely interested in making changes. They even asked for his continued involvement, and he agreed to help them stay on track, to ensure that the commitments they had made would be more than just words on paper. He didn't want to just be a part of the story. He wanted to ensure the story was still being written in a way that would matter for years to come. When Sergeant David Parker left the headquarters that day, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It had been a long road filled with frustration and doubt, but in the end, he had made a difference. The company had listened, and they were taking action. More importantly, he had learned something about himself, that sometimes standing up for what's right takes more than just speaking out. It takes persistence, patience, and the courage to push through, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Sergeant David Parker had started this journey hoping to get a resolution for himself, but in the end, he had helped create something much bigger. He had helped set a new standard, one where respect was no longer optional, and where everyone, no matter their background, could count on being treated with dignity. And that, he knew, was a victory worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed his meeting with the airline's senior leadership, Sergeant David Parker couldn't help but reflect on just how much his life had changed since that fateful flight. What had started as a simple and, in many ways, unsettling experience had spiraled into something far larger than he could have imagined. What he had thought would be a short-lived battle over a first-class seat had turned into a full-blown campaign for change, not only within the airline, but also within the broader context of how military personnel are treated by companies and the public at large. Sergeant David Parker had spent years in the military, understanding the power of discipline, order, and respect. Yet he had never really thought about how that respect should translate into the world beyond the military, especially in civilian spaces like airlines, hotels, or retail businesses. The incident had opened his eyes to a deeper issue that many soldiers faced but rarely talked about: the subtle forms of disrespect that went unnoticed by most people. It wasn't always about major incidents like being turned away at the gate or denied service, but about the small, insidious moments that made service members feel less than, as if they were somehow undeserving of the respect they were supposed to be entitled to. The feedback Sergeant David Parker received from the airline after the meeting, the tangible actions they were taking, was more than just a personal victory. It was proof that change was possible when people were willing to stand up and demand it. And for Sergeant David Parker, that was enough to make him feel like he hadn't just been fighting for his own dignity. He had been fighting for the dignity of countless others who had been subjected to similar mistreatment without ever having a chance to voice their frustrations. He could feel a quiet sense of pride building inside him, knowing that his actions had sparked a ripple effect that could help change the way businesses interacted with the military community. One afternoon, a month after the resolution, he was sitting at home when he received another email from the airline. This time, it wasn't a corporate communication or an apology. It was an invitation to be part of a focus group they were organizing. They wanted Sergeant David Parker to help shape the future of their military appreciation policies. It was clear from the invitation that they had made the changes he had requested, but now they wanted his input on how to make the experience even better for military travelers moving forward. It wasn't just lip service. The airline was actively asking for his advice, showing a commitment to make real, lasting changes. The group meeting was set for a few weeks later, and Sergeant David Parker had mixed feelings about it. He appreciated the gesture, but part of him wondered if it was just another way for the airline to tick a box. However, he also understood that real change often took time, and the fact that they were still reaching out for feedback meant that they were at least serious about improving. When the day of the focus group arrived, Sergeant David Parker found himself in a conference room with several other military veterans. They came from different branches, backgrounds, and areas of service, but all shared one common experience. They had been treated unfairly at some point during their travels. Some had been denied upgrades, others had been overlooked by customer service staff, and many had been subjected to subtle biases or stereotypes. Sergeant David Parker listened closely as they shared their stories. It was striking how many of their experiences mirrored his own, instances of being treated like an afterthought, dismissed, or even ignored. The focus group was more than just a meeting. It became a cathartic experience for everyone involved. For Sergeant David Parker, it was a chance to realize just how much of a collective issue this really was. The mistreatment wasn't just one isolated event. It was part of a pattern that had affected military members in different ways over time. Hearing the other veterans speak about their own experiences made him feel less isolated. It wasn't just about one person speaking up. It was about a community coming together to demand the respect they deserved. The meeting lasted for several hours, and by the end of it, Sergeant David Parker felt a sense of hope. He hadn't expected the airline executives present to take notes furiously, ask questions, offer explanations, and even admit that they had never fully understood the depth of the issues faced by military personnel. They were genuinely engaged. As the meeting wound down, they asked the group for concrete suggestions on how to improve their service. It wasn't just about giving them an apology anymore. It was about offering tangible solutions. Sergeant David Parker spoke up, suggesting that the airline create a dedicated support line for military personnel, a way for them to contact customer service quickly and directly without having to explain their situation repeatedly. He also recommended that the airline work more closely with veterans organizations to ensure their policies aligned with the needs of the military community. But the most important suggestion he made was simple: treat every soldier, every veteran like they matter, because they do. He also emphasized that the changes needed to be reflected in the company's culture, not just in their policies. A program can only go so far. It's the people who matter, he said. When a flight attendant is walking down the aisle and sees a soldier in uniform, they should feel a sense of pride, not just duty. They should know that what they do has real meaning. The respect has to come from the top down, and it has to be felt at every level of the company. The meeting ended on a positive note, with the airline executives thanking the veterans for their time and feedback. As Sergeant David Parker walked out of the conference room, he felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of accomplishment. Not for himself, but for the people who would follow him. The changes they were working on were more than just policies. They were about creating a cultural shift. It wasn't just about accommodating military personnel. It was about appreciating them for the sacrifices they had made, understanding the unique challenges they faced, and making them feel respected and valued every step of the way. Later that week, the airline made a public announcement about the new policies they had implemented. It wasn't just a press release, it was a commitment to change, backed by actions and initiatives that would be rolled out over the next few months. The airline had partnered with military organizations to launch a nationwide awareness campaign about the importance of treating military personnel with respect and dignity. They also introduced a new Veterans Priority Program, offering veterans and active duty military personnel access to priority seating, early boarding, and a dedicated customer service line for Sergeant David Parker. The campaign was the culmination of everything he had fought for. It wasn't just about one isolated incident. It was about ensuring that no soldier would ever have to feel the way he had felt on that flight again. The real change had come not just in the airline's policies, but in the mindset of the people who worked there. They were finally starting to see military personnel not as a special case, but as valued members of society who deserved the same respect as any other customer. As he sat back and reflected on how far things had come, Sergeant David Parker realized that the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. The change they had worked for was finally happening, and that was something worth fighting for. The journey he had started with a single complaint had grown into something much bigger, and it had the potential to make a lasting difference for generations of military personnel to come. The battle had been long, but the victory was worth it, and Sergeant David Parker knew, with a deep sense of satisfaction, that the journey was far from over. As the months passed, the changes Sergeant David Parker had pushed for began to take root. The airline's new military appreciation program was slowly gaining traction, and while it was still a work in progress, it was clear that things were improving. Veterans and active duty personnel who traveled with the airline were starting to see the benefits firsthand. Sergeant David Parker continued to stay in touch with the airline, checking in on the progress of the initiatives, offering advice, and even participating in a few more focus groups. It was becoming clear that the company was serious about its commitment to change, and he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of pride in what they had accomplished together. The impact wasn't just confined to the airline. Other companies began to take notice of what was happening, and Sergeant David Parker found himself fielding calls and emails from businesses across various industries, asking for advice on how to improve their own policies for military personnel. It was a ripple effect that he hadn't anticipated. What had started as a single incident, one man's frustration over being treated unfairly, had transformed into a larger movement, one that called for respect, appreciation, and accountability for those who had served. Sergeant David Parker knew that change was rarely instantaneous. It took time for new policies to become fully ingrained in a company's culture. But he also knew that he had sparked something powerful, something that couldn't be easily undone. The journey hadn't been easy, and it had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but the results spoke for themselves. More airlines, more businesses, more people were starting to recognize the value of respecting military personnel. It wasn't just about making an occasional gesture. It was about building a culture of respect that would last for generations. And the most satisfying part was that thousands of military personnel who would benefit from the changes could already hear the stories of soldiers, veterans, and their families traveling more easily, feeling respected, and knowing that their service was appreciated in a way it never had been before. The small victories were adding up. It wasn't just the large companies or the high-profile programs, it was the little things. A soldier walking into an airport and being greeted with respect. A veteran getting an upgraded seat without having to ask. A family traveling together not feeling like they had to fight for basic amenities. These were the things Sergeant David Parker had fought for, and now they were becoming a reality. The work was never truly finished. There was always more to be done, more ways to improve, and more people to reach. But the feeling of progress was undeniable. He had seen the airline change, seen the way they viewed their responsibility to military personnel shift, and he knew that even if he wasn't always at the forefront of the movement, his impact would be felt for a long time. Every time Sergeant David Parker walked through an airport or boarded a flight, he noticed the small changes. Flight attendants greeting military personnel with more respect. The subtle but noticeable difference in the way people interacted with soldiers in uniform. It was a quiet shift, but it was one that made all the difference. As he stood at the gate for another flight one day, Sergeant David Parker looked around at the other passengers, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. This wasn't the world he had grown up in, where soldiers like him were often overlooked or ignored. It was a world where respect was the baseline, where companies like this airline were finally recognizing the sacrifices made by those who served, and that, to him, was a victory. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a catalyst for change, a person who had seen a problem, fought for it, and in the end, helped make the world a little bit better. That feeling of having made a difference was something that would stay with him long after the story had faded from the headlines. The days after the resolution were quieter, more reflective. Sergeant David Parker returned to his routine. The work and life that had defined him before this incident had sparked such a dramatic chain of events, but now there was a sense of purpose added to his daily life. His actions, no matter how small they seemed at the time, had rippled outward in ways that would continue to affect others. The respect that had been denied to him and to so many others like him was slowly but surely being restored, not just by the airline, but by the larger corporate world, and perhaps even by society at large. Sergeant David Parker never expected to be the face of a movement, but, in a way, that's exactly what had happened. It wasn't about stepping into the limelight or chasing accolades. He had never sought fame. Instead, it was the quiet triumphs that resonated deeply with him, the knowledge that his steadfast stand had sparked a broader dialogue about dignity and respect. His actions had rippled outward, touching the lives of families who had long struggled in silence, and inspiring soldiers who, like him, deserved recognition. Every small victory felt like a thread woven into a larger tapestry of change, transforming spaces where respect had once been neglected into realms of honor and consideration. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting long shadows on the walls, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. Memories of long, arduous days and countless moments of internal battle swirled together with the warm satisfaction of knowing that his perseverance had made a difference. There were nights when doubt had crept in, when the weight of every setback had made him question if the struggle was even worth it. Yet, now he could see clearly, every ounce of his energy had contributed to a seismic shift in how military service was valued. Not only had the airline revised its policies, but a new wave of respect for veterans had begun to emerge, as more businesses introduced initiatives to honor those who served. He understood, too, that true change was never immediate or flawless. It unfolded slowly, in imperfect but significant steps. The transformation was gradual, building one respectful interaction at a time. He had fought not merely for his own dignity, but for all those who would follow in his footsteps. For the veterans who boarded flights, stepped into restaurants, or walked into any establishment expecting to be treated with the decency they deserved. His struggle had become a beacon, a promise that the future held more understanding and empathy for those who had given so much. Though the road ahead remained long and uncertain, the trials of the past few months had revealed a powerful truth. Sometimes the most profound victories emerge from the battles you never anticipated fighting. The simple act of standing up against disrespect had ignited a movement that extended far beyond a single flight incident, shaping a future where respect for service and sacrifice was not optional, but expected. Sergeant David Parker had won, but more importantly, he had made sure that the world would be a little bit better for those who would come after him, and that, to him, was the ultimate victory. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to subscribe for more engaging videos. Thank you for watching. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you so much.